On November 12, 1995, a 12-year-old altar boy named Mikey Sullivan vanished from inside the cavernous walls of Boston's Cathedral of the Holy Cross. For 20 agonizing years, his case remained a cold, heartbreaking mystery, a ghost story whispered in the pews of a city that had all but given up hope. The official story pointed to a runaway, then later a tragic abduction by a stranger. But the truth was far more sinister, hidden beneath layers of sacred stone and silence. The case was considered permanently unsolved, a wound that would never heal for his family. That is, until a small pocket Bible, tucked away behind a loose brick for 2 decades, finally revealed a deadly code left by the boy himself. How is it possible that the truth, a conspiracy of greed and murder, remained buried for so long, right under the feet of the faithful, in the very heart of the church? Before we reveal how a single verse marked in a forgotten Bible unraveled a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the church, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the chain of events that this small, hidden book set in motion. The story you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and that sometimes the faintest whisper from the past can be loud enough to bring down an empire built on lies. What that Bible contained was more than just scripture. It was a map, a cry for help, and a final, desperate act of courage from a boy who knew his time was running out. The journey to deciphering his message would unearth a darkness no one ever imagined existed within those hallowed walls. Michael Sullivan, known to everyone in his South Boston neighborhood as Mikey, was the kind of boy every parent dreamed of. At 12, he was bright, deeply devout, and possessed a curiosity that was infectious. His fascination with history was a perfect match for his role as an altar boy at the ancient cathedral, a place steeped in legends he loved to read about. For his parents, an ironworker father and a school cafeteria worker mother, having their son serve at the altar was a profound source of pride, a symbol of their faith and hard work. Mikey's dream was to one day attend Boston College and become a historian, uncovering the city's secrets. His greatest vulnerability wasn't his age, but his unwavering trust in the institution he served and in his charismatic mentor, Father Patrick Connolly. It was this pure, innocent faith that would ultimately lead him into mortal danger. The afternoon of his disappearance was unremarkable, a typical gray and drizzly New England Saturday. Inside the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, the air was thick with the scent of old incense and damp stone. Mikey was diligently helping Father Connolly prepare the vestments for the upcoming evening Mass, his movements precise and practiced. As a final task, the priest asked him to retrieve an old silver thurible, an ornate incense burner that was rarely used. It was kept in a small, dusty storeroom located near the entrance to the crypts, a sprawling subterranean labyrinth that was officially sealed off to the public. Several parishioners saw the boy, a small figure in his simple clothes, walking with purpose through the sacristy toward that forgotten corner of the church. It was the last time anyone would see him alive. The ordinary nature of that final request would haunt everyone for years to come. When Mikey didn't return after 15 minutes, Father Connolly later told police, he felt a flicker of annoyance, assuming the boy had gotten distracted. He went to the storeroom to hurry him along, but the room was empty. The door was ajar, and the silver thurible was still on its shelf, untouched. The initial reaction among the clergy was one of confusion, not panic. Perhaps he had slipped out a side door to go home without telling anyone. But that theory evaporated when Mikey's mother called the cathedral an hour later, her voice tight with worry, asking why her son wasn't home yet. It was then that a cold dread began to settle over the sacred space. A frantic search began, first by the priests and staff, then expanding to include parishioners and volunteers. They scoured every chapel, every hallway, every confessional, but it was as if Mikey Sullivan had simply dissolved into thin air. The initial police investigation was, by all accounts, a disaster of deference and missed opportunities. In 1995, Boston, the Catholic Archdiocese, wielded immense power, an institution that city officials and law enforcement rarely dared to challenge. Detectives from the Boston Police Department were allowed into the cathedral, but their search was heavily guided by church staff. They were steered away from sensitive areas, particularly the sprawling crypts, which were dismissed as structurally unsound and irrelevant to the search for a missing child. The lack of technology was also a major handicap. With no cell phones to trace and virtually no CCTV cameras inside the historic building, investigators had no digital trail to follow. The investigation was forced to rely on witness testimony and old-fashioned police work, but within the closed, guarded world of the cathedral, answers were not forthcoming. The walls that were meant to provide sanctuary instead provided the perfect cover for a terrible secret. The pressure to solve the case was immense, and with no solid leads emerging from within the cathedral, the investigation quickly shifted its focus outward. Detectives began looking for a convenient scapegoat, someone who could fit the public's image of a predator. They found one in a homeless man named Joseph Silent Joe Murphy, a Vietnam veteran who often slept on the church steps. Joe was a quiet, troubled man, known for his erratic behavior but never for violence. He had a history of petty theft and, crucially, no verifiable alibi for the time Mikey disappeared. Based on flimsy circumstantial evidence and the dubious testimony of a parishioner who claimed to have seen him lurking, Joe was arrested. The media ran with the story, painting him as a dangerous drifter who had preyed on an innocent child. For a city desperate for answers, it was an easy narrative to accept. The real culprits watched from the shadows, as an innocent man was offered up to quench the public's thirst for justice. For the Sullivan family, the arrest and subsequent conviction of Silent Joe brought no peace. In fact, it only deepened their private agony. Mikey's father, a strong man who had spent his life building skyscrapers, began to crumble. He couldn't reconcile the official story with the son he knew. Mikey was cautious, taught from a young age not to talk to strangers. The idea that he would have been lured away from the church by a man like Joe felt wrong. This gnawing doubt, coupled with his grief, drove him into a spiral of alcoholism that cost him his job, his health, and his spirit. Mikey's mother retreated into a different kind of prison. She attended Mass daily, her prayers becoming a silent, obsessive ritual. She'd sit in the same pew, staring at the altar where her son once served, her face a mask of sorrow. The joy was drained from their home, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, the sound of a loss too profound to ever be truly named. Years turned into a decade, then two. The story of the vanished altar boy faded from the headlines, becoming another piece of Boston folklore, a cautionary tale for children. Silent Joe died in prison in 2008, succumbing to liver failure, still maintaining his innocence to the very end. For the Boston Police Department and the Archdiocese, the case was officially closed, a tragic but resolved chapter. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross continued its timeless rhythms of worship and ceremony, its stone walls holding their secrets tightly. The memory of Mikey Sullivan was preserved in a small, fading photograph in his parents' living room, a ghost of a smiling boy forever frozen at the age of 12. The world had moved on, convinced it knew the truth. But behind a loose brick in the sacristy wall, a small Bible lay waiting, a silent witness holding the key to a conspiracy that was far from over. The catalyst for the truth arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet diligence of a young man who simply wanted to do his job well. In the summer of 2015, a new sacristan named Kevin Doyle was tasked with conducting a full inventory of the sacristy's contents, a tedious job that hadn't been performed in decades. While struggling to move a heavy, antique oak wardrobe, he noticed that one of the old bricks in the wall behind it was loose. Most people would have ignored it, but Kevin was meticulous. Driven by a flicker of curiosity, he worked his fingers into the crack and pried it out. In the dark, hollow space behind it, his hand brushed against something wrapped in cloth. He carefully pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound pocket Bible, preserved against the damp. His heart began to pound as he saw the name embossed in faded gold on the cover. Michael Sullivan. Inside the quiet sacristy, the air suddenly felt heavy. charged with the significance of his discovery. Kevin Doyle held the small Bible in his hands, its worn leather cool against his skin. This wasn't just an old book. It was a relic from a forgotten tragedy. The name Michael Sullivan was more than just letters on a cover. It was a ghost that had haunted the cathedral for 2 decades. Every long-serving priest, every older parishioner knew the story of the altar boy who had vanished. Finding this felt like unearthing a tombstone, a final, tangible piece of a boy whose life had been reduced to whispers and warnings. Kevin's initial thought was to turn it over to the current dean immediately, to follow protocol. But a deep, gut-level instinct told him to pause. Something about the way it was hidden felt deliberate, a message intended for someone who would understand its secrecy. With trembling fingers, Kevin gently opened the Bible. The pages were stiff but remarkably well preserved. He thumbed through them, expecting to find nothing more than the usual underlinings of a devout child. Then he saw it. A single page was marked with a small folded corner, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29. His eyes scanned the page until they landed on the 11th verse, a passage of profound hope familiar to millions. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope and a future. For a moment, a wave of sadness washed over him. He imagined young Mikey, perhaps sensing danger, leaving behind a final message of faith. But then, his gaze caught a tiny, almost invisible notation in the margin, written in faint pencil. It wasn't a word, but a simple code, C14. The hopefulness of the scripture instantly vanished, replaced by a chilling realization. This wasn't a message of faith, it was a map. The discovery placed Kevin at a dangerous crossroads. He was a young man in a new job, an outsider in an institution built on centuries of hierarchy and internal politics. He knew the official story of Mikey's disappearance and the conviction of Silent Joe. He also knew from hushed conversations with older staff that the original police investigation had been a masterclass in institutional stonewalling. To hand the Bible over to the archdiocese felt like a betrayal of the boy who had so carefully hidden it. He feared it would be quietly absorbed into an archive, its secret buried for another 20 years under the guise of protecting the church from scandal. He looked at the name on the cover again. This was Michael Sullivan's last testament. In that moment, Kevin made a decision that would change everything. He would follow the clue himself, in secret. The truth, he felt, deserved at least one person willing to search for it. While this flicker of hope was being kindled in secret, the Sullivan family remained trapped in a prison of ambiguous loss. Their small South Boston home had become a shrine to a ghost. Mikey's bedroom was left untouched, a time capsule from 1995. His baseball trophies gathered dust on the shelf. His school books sat on his desk, waiting for a boy who would never return. His mother, Mary, still washed and folded his altar boy robes once a month, a heartbreaking ritual of denial. The silence between her and her husband, John, was a physical presence in the house, thick with unspoken grief and blame. 20 years had passed, but for them, it was still November 12, 1995. Every ringing phone, every knock at the door, still carried a faint, foolish glimmer of hope that was immediately crushed by the weight of reality. The conviction of Silent Joe had offered them no closure, only a hollow, unsatisfying answer to a question that screamed in their souls. John Sullivan's grief had been a loud, destructive force. A man who had built his life on physical strength and hard labor found himself powerless against an invisible enemy. In the early years, his rage was directed outward. He hounded the detectives, pointing out inconsistencies in the case against Silent Joe, convinced they had arrested the wrong man out of convenience. He spent his weekends conducting his own pathetic investigations, revisiting the cathedral, questioning anyone who would talk to him. But the walls of the church were as impenetrable as the silence from the police department. Each dead end, each dismissive response, pushed him deeper into a bottle. Alcohol became the only thing that could numb the searing pain of not knowing, of failing to protect his only son. His strong hands, once capable of shaping steel, began to shake and the man who once built the city's skyline could no longer hold his own family together. Mary's suffering was a quieter, more corrosive affair. Where John raged, she prayed. Her profound Catholic faith, once the bedrock of her life, transformed into a complex form of penance. She attended Mass every single day, sitting in the same pew, her eyes fixed on the altar where her son had last served. She saw his ghost in the flickering candles and the face of every new altar boy. Her prayers were no longer conversations with God, but desperate, monotonous pleas for a sign, for an answer, for an end to the torment of uncertainty. Over the years, Father Patrick Connolly had been a constant presence, offering her comfort and spiritual guidance. He would hold her hand, listen to her sorrow, and speak of God's mysterious plan. Mary clung to his words, never suspecting that the man offering her solace was the gatekeeper of the very secret that was destroying her life from the inside out. The case of Michael Sullivan had long been relegated to the cold case files at the Boston Police Department, a dusty folder filled with dead ends, and a conviction that everyone, except the boy's father, had accepted as justice. The city had moved on. New tragedies had captured the headlines, and the story of the vanished altar boy became a sad piece of local lore. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross stood as it always had, a monument of stone and faith, its secrets locked securely within its sacred architecture. But now, 20 years later, a young sacristan held the key. The small Bible felt impossibly heavy in Kevin Doyle's hands, burdened with the weight of a family's shattered life and a murdered boy's final, desperate plea. He knew his next step. In the cathedral's archives, among centuries of baptismal records and property deeds, were the original blueprints of the building. He had to find out what C-14 meant. Kevin Doyle knew he was holding a ghost's final words, and the weight of that responsibility was immense. The notation C-14 was a cipher without a key, a meaningless combination of a letter and a number. His first instinct was to search online, but this was a clue from 1995, long before the Internet cataloged every corner of the world. The answer, he reasoned, had to be physical, located somewhere within the cathedral itself. He thought of the building's vast, dusty archives, a place few people ever entered. It was a repository of centuries of church history, containing property deeds, baptismal records, and, he hoped, the original architectural plans of the cathedral. Under the guise of researching the history of the sacristy's furnishings, he requested access. He had to move carefully. He was now an investigator, in a place that had proven it could bury secrets for decades. The archives were located in a cold, sub-basement room, a stark contrast to the divine art and soaring ceilings of the church above. The air was thick, with the smell of decaying paper and forgotten history. Rows of metal shelves were crammed with leather-bound ledgers and rolled-up schematics. After hours of searching through disorganized files, he found it, a large cylindrical tube containing the original 19th-century blueprints of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. With hands that felt clumsy and loud in the oppressive silence, he unrolled the brittle parchment on a large wooden table. The intricate drawings depicted a building that was a world unto itself, with hidden stairwells and forgotten passages. His eyes frantically scanned the detailed layout of the lower levels, the sprawling, labyrinthine crypts. He felt a surge of adrenaline as he traced the grid system used by the architects, his finger moving from C-1, C-2, C-3, until it finally landed on its destination. There it was, C-14. It was a small, seemingly insignificant chamber deep in the oldest section of the crypts, a part of the catacombs that branched off from the main passages. But what made Kevin's blood run cold was the faint, handwritten annotation next to it, dated from a 1970s structural survey. It read, "Sealed, high risk of collapse." He stared at the words, the official story neatly written in faded ink. This was the area the police had been explicitly warned away from during their search in 1995. The church had claimed it was for their own safety. But now, seeing it marked on a map left by a terrified boy, the explanation felt hollow. a convenient lie designed to keep people out. Mikey hadn't just left a location. He had pointed directly to the heart of the cover-up. The sealed sector wasn't a hazard. It was a hiding place. The knowledge was a dangerous burden. Kevin was no detective. He was a sacristan, a low-level employee in a powerful, self-policing institution. To go to the police now, with nothing more than a 20-year-old Bible and a cryptic note, would be professional suicide. They would dismiss him, and word would get back to the archdiocese, who would surely bury the evidence for good this time. He looked at the photograph of the blueprint he'd secretly taken with his phone. He saw the face of the boy from the old news clippings, trusting and innocent. He couldn't let him down. There was only one path forward. He had to go into the crypts himself. He had to see what was in Sector C-14. He would wait until the cathedral was empty, until the dead of night, when the only witnesses would be the saints in the stained glass windows. That night, the cathedral was a place of profound silence and deep shadows. After locking the great front doors, Kevin slipped away not to the exit, but down a narrow stone staircase behind the main altar that led to the crypts. The heavy oak door at the bottom groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The air that hit him was ancient and cold, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, the funereal smell of decay. Armed with a powerful flashlight and the map on his phone, he stepped into the darkness. The beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, illuminating rows of stone sarcophagi and sealed burial niches. The names of long-dead bishops and benefactors were carved into the walls, their stone eyes seeming to follow his every move. Every creak, every drip of water, echoed in the oppressive stillness, amplifying his fear. He was an intruder in a sacred, silent world. He navigated the maze of passages for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve. Finally, he reached the location marked on the blueprint. Just as the old notes indicated, the entrance to Sector C-14 was blocked by what appeared to be a rock fall, a messy pile of stone and debris that made the passage look completely impassable. It looked convincing, but as his flashlight beam traced the edges of the blockage, he noticed something odd. The dust on the floor in front of it was subtly disturbed, and the stones, while old, seemed arranged with an unnatural precision. They weren't piled randomly, as they would be in a natural collapse. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, he pushed against one of the largest boulders. It didn't budge. He tried another, lower down. To his astonishment, it shifted, scraping against the stone floor. It wasn't a rockfall. It was a wall, built to deceive. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he worked frantically, pulling away the loose stones until a small, dark opening was revealed. He squeezed through, his clothes snagging on the rough edges, and dropped into the chamber on the other side. The air here was different, stale and utterly still, untouched for years. He swept his flashlight across the small, stone-walled room. He saw no human remains, no signs of a struggle. For a devastating second, he thought he had been wrong. But then the beam of light landed on a simple wooden crate tucked into a corner. He knelt and pried open the lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp, were not the bones of a lost boy, but stacks of accounting ledgers, detailed photographs of priceless chalices and tapestries, and bundles of correspondence written on official diocesan letterhead. In that instant, the terrible truth began to dawn on him. Mikey Sullivan hadn't stumbled upon a killer. He had stumbled upon a crime syndicate operating from the very heart of the cathedral. The contents of the crate laid bare the anatomy of a breathtakingly audacious crime. The ledgers were not simple accounting books. They were meticulous records of a secret enterprise, detailing the theft and sale of priceless historical artifacts that belonged to the cathedral. Each entry listed an item: a 16th-century gold chalice, a medieval tapestry, an illuminated manuscript, alongside a coded buyer initial and a staggering price. The photographs were the most damning evidence of all. They showed the original artifacts side by side with flawless replicas. This was a sophisticated, long-running operation, a systematic plundering of the Church's most sacred treasures, all happening under the noses of the faithful. Mikey hadn't just discovered a secret room, he had stumbled upon a clandestine auction house operating out of the house of God. The scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to comprehend, a conspiracy of greed hiding in plain sight. As Kevin carefully photographed each page with his phone, the architects of the conspiracy began to emerge from the faded ink. The correspondence, written on official diocesan letterhead, was filled with arrangements for shipping, payments, and the commissioning of the replicas. Most were signed with the initials A, B, and PC. For anyone familiar with the cathedral's history, the identities were chillingly clear. A.B. was Monsignor Alistair Blackwood, the ambitious and worldly dean of the cathedral in 1995, a man known for his expensive tastes and powerful connections. And P.C. was Father Patrick Connolly, Mikey's beloved mentor, the gentle, charismatic priest who had comforted his mother for 2 decades. The men the boy trusted most, the very shepherds of his flock, were the wolves. One was the mastermind, the other the trusted face of the operation, using his position of love and authority as the perfect cover. The ledgers revealed the motive with cold, mathematical precision, pure, unadulterated greed. This wasn't about funding church repairs or charitable works. The money, amounting to millions of dollars over several years, was being funneled into a series of numbered offshore bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. The conspiracy was a masterclass in deception, exploiting the one thing no one would ever question, the sanctity of the church's vaults. Who would dare audit God's treasures? Blackwood and Connolly had turned the cathedral into their personal bank, selling off centuries of history to a secretive network of billionaire collectors who valued possession over provenance. It was a betrayal not just of faith, but of the generations of Bostonians who had donated these items, believing they were securing a piece of their legacy within those sacred walls. Then, Kevin found the entry that connected this vast financial crime directly to the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy. On a page dated for the second week of November 1995, an entry for a large transaction, the sale of a set of jewel-encrusted silver candlesticks, was marked with a brief, handwritten note in the margin. It read, "Shipment delayed, complication." The date of the note was November 12, 1995. A cold dread washed over Kevin as he stared at the words. The complication had a name, Mikey Sullivan. The boy, with his insatiable curiosity and his freedom to roam the cathedral's hidden corners, must have seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Perhaps he followed Father Connolly to the crypt, or overheard a conversation, or simply stumbled upon the hidden chamber by accident. Whatever he discovered, it had sealed his fate. He wasn't the victim of a random predator. He was a witness who had to be silenced. Kevin knew he was holding a story that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the Catholic Church. Going to the Boston police felt like a risk. The department's deference to the archdiocese in 1995 was legendary, and he couldn't be sure those attitudes had changed. To hand the evidence back to the church itself was unthinkable. It would be buried forever. He realized there was only one institution powerful enough to take on another: the press. After days of agonizing, he made an anonymous call to *the Boston Globe, requesting a meeting with Sarah Jenkins, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter known for her tenacity and her refusal to be intimidated by power. In a clandestine meeting in a quiet corner of the Boston Public Library, he handed over the digital copies of everything he had found. It was a leap of faith into the secular world, a belief that the truth mattered more than the institution that had hidden it. The evidence landed like a bombshell in the *Globe's investigative unit. For weeks, Sarah Jenkins and her team worked in absolute secrecy, transforming Kevin's discovery into an ironclad case. They meticulously cross-referenced the ledgers with shipping manifests from the Port of Boston in the mid-90s, finding records of artisan reproductions being sent to the cathedral from a high-end workshop in Belgium. They hired forensic accountants who, with painstaking effort, traced the flow of money from the coded buyers to the offshore accounts, confirming they were still active and controlled by shell corporations linked back to Blackwood. They even managed to identify one of the buyers, a reclusive art collector in Zurich, whose lawyer, when presented with the evidence, confirmed his client had purchased several items, believing them to be deaccessioned church property. The web of deceit stretched from Boston to Geneva, and every thread they pulled unraveled another lie. The investigation ultimately led them to the two men at the center of the conspiracy, who were now living very different lives. Monsignor Alistair Blackwood had risen through the ranks, his wealth and influence securing him a powerful position as a cardinal in the Vatican, insulated by layers of protocol and diplomatic immunity. He was untouchable, a prince of the church living a life of luxury built on stolen history. Father Patrick Connolly, however, remained in Boston. He was now an elderly, frail man, retired and living in a modest diocesan residence, still widely beloved as a compassionate spiritual guide. He was the keeper of the darkest secret, the man who had held Mary Sullivan's hand and listened to her weep for the son he had helped murder. As the Asterisk Globe prepared to publish its story, the walls began to close in on these two men, who had believed for 20 years that their sins, like Mikey's body, were buried deep enough to never be found. The front page of Asterisk the Boston Globe on a crisp October morning in 2015 was not just news, it was a seismic event. The headline, Cathedral of Lies, accompanied by a faded photo of a smiling Mikey Sullivan, sent a shockwave through the city. The story, meticulously detailed with photographs of the ledgers and expert analysis, laid bare the entire conspiracy. It was a stunning account of greed, sacrilege, and a 20-year cover-up that had sacrificed an innocent boy and an innocent man to protect two powerful predators. The Archdiocese issued an immediate, forceful denial, calling the report scurrilous and unfounded speculation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public outcry was deafening. After 2 decades of silence, the ghost of Mikey Sullivan was finally screaming for justice, and this time, the entire city was listening with horrified attention. The fallout was immediate and personal. For Father Patrick Connolly, the story's publication was the beginning of the end. Reporters and news vans descended upon his quiet diocesan retirement home, transforming his peaceful refuge into a media encampment. But it wasn't the cameras he feared. It was the knock on the door that came late that afternoon. 2 grim-faced Boston police detectives, holding a copy of the newspaper, stood on his threshold. The gentle, compassionate facade he had maintained for decades crumbled in an instant. The weight of 20 years of lies, of holding Mary Sullivan's hand while knowing he was responsible for her agony, finally crushed him. The frail, elderly man, leaning heavily on his walker, began to weep uncontrollably. His carefully constructed world of piety and deception had just been demolished by the faint pencil markings of a boy he had betrayed. In a sterile interrogation room at BPD headquarters, under the flat, unforgiving fluorescent lights, Father Connolly's confession poured out not as a defiant denial, but as a torrent of exhausted surrender. With his lawyer by his side and Sarah Jenkins present as an observer, he spoke for hours, his voice a frail, raspy whisper. He recounted the events of November 12, 1995, with a clarity that was both chilling and pathetic. The crime, he explained, had not been premeditated. It was born of a single, catastrophic moment of discovery. Mikey, with his innate curiosity and his love for the cathedral's hidden corners, had accidentally stumbled upon the loose brick before he hid his own Bible there. He had peeked inside, seen the strange ledgers, and with the innocent trust of a child, had brought one to his mentor, asking, "Father, what are these secret books for? Are they part of the church's history?" Connolly described the sheer, cold panic that seized him in that moment. His world, built on a foundation of stolen wealth and deception, was about to be shattered by the innocent question of a 12-year-old boy. He told Mikey the books were part of a secret church project, and, to keep him from saying anything, convinced him to play a game. He led the boy down to the crypts, telling him he was going to show him a special, hidden place that only the most trusted altar boys got to see. He locked the trusting child inside the small chamber, C14, promising to come back for him after evening mass with Monsignor Blackwood, who would explain everything. Mikey, who idolized both men, went without a fight, believing he was part of an important secret. It was a lie that sealed his fate, a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. The moment the heavy stones were back in place, Connolly rushed to his office and made the most important phone call of his life. He called Monsignor Alistair Blackwood, who was attending a diocesan function across town. In a hushed, frantic voice, he explained what had happened. The boy had found the ledgers. He knew. He was locked in the crypt. Connolly's confession made the power dynamic brutally clear. He had been the face, the trusted hand, but Blackwood was the cold, calculating mind of the operation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Blackwood gave his directive, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. "Patrick," he said, "this is not a complication we can afford. The boy is a threat to everything. A threat must be removed, permanently." In that single, chilling sentence, a boy's life was reduced to a business liability that needed to be liquidated. Later that night, long after the last of the search parties had given up, the two priests returned to the darkened cathedral. They led a confused and frightened Mikey out of the crypts and into a waiting car, telling him they were taking him somewhere safe until things blew over. They drove for over an hour, deep into the rural countryside of western Massachusetts, to a remote, undeveloped parcel of land the diocese had purchased years earlier for a future retreat center that was never built. It was there, under a moonless sky, surrounded by the silent woods, that they ended the boy's life. Connolly, in his confession, broke down completely at this point, unable to articulate the final, horrific details. He simply stated that Blackwood insisted it had to be done, and that they buried Mikey's body in a shallow, unmarked grave where no one would ever think to look. Armed with a hand-drawn map provided by the weeping priest, Boston police and forensic teams descended on the quiet, overgrown property. For 2 days, they excavated the area Connolly had marked. John and Mary Sullivan waited in a car at the edge of the woods, a vigil of unbearable tension. Then, late on the second afternoon, one of the investigators slowly removed his hat. They had found him. The search for Michael Sullivan was finally over. The recovery of his small remains, after 20 years buried in unconsecrated ground, was not a moment of triumph, but one of profound, soul-crushing sorrow. They could finally bring their son home for a proper burial, but the truth of how he had been stolen from them was a wound far deeper than any grave. Justice had begun its slow, grinding turn, but for the Sullivan family, peace would forever remain just out of reach. The trial of Cardinal Alistair Blackwood and Father Patrick Connolly was a spectacle that gripped not just Boston, but the entire world. For months, the city watched as the sordid details of their criminal enterprise were laid bare in a courtroom packed with journalists and the hollow-eyed Sullivan family. Connolly, frail and broken, testified against the man who had been his master, his voice barely a whisper as he recounted the conspiracy and the murder. Blackwood, in stark contrast, remained defiant, his face a mask of aristocratic arrogance. He denied everything, his lawyers painting him as the victim of a jealous underling. But the evidence, the ledgers, the offshore accounts, the confession, was irrefutable. The jury took less than a day to find them both guilty. Connolly received a sentence of 25 years to life. Blackwood, the unrepentant mastermind, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 20 years after he disappeared, Michael Sullivan was finally laid to rest. The funeral was held at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, the very place that had been the stage for both his life and his death. It was an impossibly difficult decision for his parents, but Mary Sullivan insisted. This was his house of God, not theirs, she said. The pews were filled not with cardinals and bishops, but with the working-class people of South Boston, the ironworkers and cafeteria ladies who had known Mikey as a bright, smiling neighborhood kid. As John and Mary stood over the small casket, the crushing weight of 2 decades of uncertainty finally lifted, replaced by the solid, terrible finality of grief. They were no longer the parents of a missing boy. They were the parents of a murdered son, and in that brutal truth, they found the first, painful step toward a different kind of peace. In the wake of the verdict, another long overdue act of justice took place. Joseph "Silent Joe" Murphy was officially and posthumously exonerated. The Boston Police Department and the mayor's office issued a formal public apology for the catastrophic failure of the original investigation and for railroading an innocent man to close a case. His name was cleared, his record expunged. There was no family to receive the apology, as Joe had been estranged from his relatives for decades. Instead, a small group of veterans, advocates, gathered at his unmarked grave in the city's Potter's Field, placing a simple stone marker that read, "Joseph Murphy, a soldier, an innocent man. May he rest in peace." His tragic story became a permanent, shameful footnote in the case, a stark reminder of how easily the powerless can be sacrificed to protect the powerful. The scandal sent a shockwave through the American Catholic Church, forcing a reckoning that was decades overdue. The Vatican, deeply embarrassed by the actions of a cardinal, launched its own internal investigation, leading to a complete overhaul of how the Church manages and secures its priceless historical and artistic assets. New, transparent protocols were implemented worldwide, designed to prevent such a systematic looting from ever happening again. In Boston, the archdiocese was forced into a period of deep introspection and public penance. Trust, once the bedrock of its authority, had been shattered. It would take generations to rebuild, if it ever could be fully restored. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross, once a symbol of untouchable power, now stood as a monument to a profound and very human betrayal. John and Mary Sullivan used a portion of the civil settlement they received from the Archdiocese to create the Mikey Sullivan Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to advocating for the safety of children in institutional settings, be they religious, educational, or governmental. They channeled their unimaginable pain into a new purpose, ensuring no other family would suffer the way they had. And inside the sacristy of the cathedral, a quiet but powerful memorial was installed. The loose brick was replaced, but this time it was sealed behind a small pane of protective glass. A simple brass plaque was mounted beneath it. It reads, "This stone concealed the truth for 20 years. In memory of Mikey Sullivan, whose faith was stronger than these walls." It serves as a permanent, silent testament to the boy who solved his own murder. In the years that followed, John and Mary Sullivan found a quiet rhythm. They would visit Mikey's grave every Sunday after Mass, not with the frantic desperation of the past, but with a somber sense of peace. The suffocating silence that had filled their home for 2 decades was slowly replaced by stories, by memories of the boy he was, not the ghost he had become. The wound never fully healed. Some losses are too deep to ever mend, but it was no longer an open, gaping agony. Justice had been served, the truth had been unearthed, and their son was finally home. From beyond the grave, a 12-year-old boy, armed with nothing but his faith and a small pocket Bible, had left a whisper in the dark, a whisper that, 20 years later, grew into a roar loud enough to bring down an empire built on lies. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten, and that the search for truth is essential, please share this story. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that demand to be told. Thank you for listening. The story of Michael Sullivan is more than just the resolution of a cold case. It is a stark reminder that the most profound evil often wears a mask of piety. It reveals how institutions built to protect the vulnerable can, in their pursuit of self-preservation, become the very source of their destruction. The conspiracy was not undone by a brilliant detective or a high-tech investigation, but by the quiet, desperate act of a child who refused to let the truth die with him. His small pocket Bible, hidden in a dark recess, became a beacon that cut through 2 decades of calculated silence. It proved that no wall, no matter how sacred or imposing, is strong enough to contain a secret forever. The legacy of this case is a testament to the corrosive power of greed and the enduring strength of a single, courageous whisper from the past. For John and Mary Sullivan, the end of the legal battle was not an end to their pain, but the beginning of a new chapter. They transformed their grief into a powerful force for change, establishing the Mikey Sullivan Foundation. Their mission is simple yet profound: to advocate for the safety of children within powerful institutions, be it religious, educational, or governmental. They travel the country, sharing their story not as a tale of despair, but as a warning. They work with organizations to develop stronger vetting processes and transparent reporting systems, creating the kind of oversight that might have saved their son. In this way, Mikey's memory has become a shield for countless other children. His life, so tragically cut short, has found a new and lasting purpose in the protection of innocence, ensuring his legacy is one of hope and vigilance, not just sorrow. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross still stands, its spires reaching for the heavens, but its shadow now carries a different weight. It is a place forever marked by the scandal, a living monument to a devastating betrayal. The memorial plaque in the sacristy, preserving the very spot where Mikey hid his Bible, serves as a permanent, silent sermon on the nature of truth. It is a constant reminder to the clergy and the faithful alike that the institution is fallible, its leaders are human, and its secrets can have deadly consequences. The Archdiocese of Boston was forced into a painful public reckoning, one that stripped away its veneer of infallibility. The trust that was so easily exploited by Blackwood and Connolly will take generations to rebuild, a scar on the soul of the city that will never fully fade. Ultimately, the story comes back to the faith of a 12-year-old boy, not the blind faith he placed in the men who betrayed him, but the faith he placed in the future. In his final, terrified moments, Mikey did not simply give up. He performed an act of profound courage, leaving behind a breadcrumb trail that he believed, with all his heart, someone would one day follow. He trusted that goodness would eventually find a way to triumph over the darkness he had witnessed. His legacy is not that of a victim, but of the story's most unlikely and heroic investigator. He used the very symbol of his faith, the Bible, as his final weapon, a tool to carve a path for justice through 20 years of stone and silence. His was a faith not in the institution, but in the enduring power of truth itself. If you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, no matter how long it has been silenced, please share this story. The fight for truth often depends on the willingness of ordinary people to bear witness and demand accountability. Subscribe to our channel for more investigations that give a voice to the voiceless and ensure that no victim is ever truly forgotten. Thank you for listening and for remembering Michael Sullivan.